Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome, everyone. My name is Martine Stillman, and I'm the VP of Engineering at Synapse Product Development. It's my privilege to welcome you here to do better, how to improve the sustainability of your products. We're so happy you're spending time with us today, and we hope you'll learn something new no matter where you are on your sustainability journey. Ideally, you'll gain new perspectives on our collective future and how our companies can fit into it. In case you're not familiar with Synapse, at Synapse, our bread and butter is product development, engineering, and consulting. We work from early concept through designing for manufacture. Given this broad consultancy, we're in a unique position to see how sustainable design could be applied across industries. But that said, we're not the authority in all the facets of the space. So for the purposes of today's panel, we've assembled an amazing team of experts from different corners of the field, both from product, recycling, end-of-life management, lifecycle assessment, and product development. Today, we'll be covering a variety of topics about integrating sustainability into product development. We'll talk about various barriers, opportunities, and some techniques that might be helpful. We're also excited about this panel because it marks the release of an ebook Synapse has been working on in sustainability and product design. Today's panel won't go deep on every piece of this topic, so if you want to learn more about how we do it at Synapse, on Monday we'll send out this ebook as a follow-up email to all attendees, along with a recording of this panel. This book covers more about our sustainable development process and also has a lot of great tips on how you can apply it in the real world. Today's audience comes from a variety of backgrounds in a variety of industries, so from ag tech to appliances and cars to universities, and everybody is at a different point of learning and expertise on this topic. Even the experts are learning in a field as quickly developing as this one, so we hope that the things that we discuss today will be applicable to more than just hardware and that everyone will advance their understanding of the topic. With that, I'm going to turn it over for some introductions from our wonderful panelists, and we'll get started. So let's start with Daniel Fitzgerald. Daniel, take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Fitzgerald. I am the Product Sustainability Director at Stanley Black & Decker. I've been with the company for 14 years. I have a background in engineering from the University of Maryland, go Terps, and I'm very happy to be here discussing sustainability with you today. Welcome.
Great. All right, let's move on to Sharisa.
Hi, my name is Sharisa Rajanovic. I'm the Director of Technology at Maui Greens. Previously, I led the Recycling Innovation Program at Apple, where we designed automated disassembly solutions for electronic waste. And I also have a background in sustainable material product development and manufacturing from Nike and Patagonia.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to Lisa.
Hi, Lisa Lauren, CEO of Earthshift Global. I founded Earthshift 20 years ago to help businesses with lifecycle assessment and sustainable return on investment to help them on their sustainability journeys. So we've since then worked with Fortune 500, small companies, startups, as well as governments and NGOs.
Great. And Will Harrison.
Yeah, I'm Will Harrison. I'm a mechanical engineer. Been working in product development consultancy for just over 7 years now, the last 3 of which have been here in Seattle at Synapse. I've worked across a broad range of industries, product categories, everything from industrial robotics all the way through to consumer electronics, even beer dispensing appliances. While working on these, I've seen the opportunities there are for sustainable design, but I've also seen the barriers there are to implementation. That's why in the last few months, I've been working closely with a team at Synapse and leading that team to develop a sustainable design process that we're incorporating into our product development practices. I'm excited to discuss sustainable design with all the panelists here today and looking forward to share some of our knowledge and best practices with everyone out there.
Great. All right, so we're going to start at the very beginning of where people might be engaging with this topic. So our first question is about getting started. The first question, and I think we're going to start out with Daniel Fitzgerald from Stanley Black & Decker, and I think Lisa will also be jumping in on this one. So the first question is twofold. First, what are the first steps to engaging in sustainability? And the second half of that is what might be compelling motivators for companies to begin on this journey? I know a lot of audience participants had a lot of questions about this. So Daniel, why don't you get us started?
Sure, thanks. So the first step at Stanley Black & Decker was leadership engagement. So for a little history, since at least 2000, our company was quietly driving operational sustainability in the manufacturing site, so energy, waste, water, under then CEO John Lundgren and our current Chief Responsibility Officer, Deb Geyer. And so, through those years, we were making progress with transparency. We began reporting to Carbon Disclosure Project and Dow Jones Sustainable Index, which drove, what should be collected and reported. But things really kicked off when our current CEO, Jim Lurie, took over in 2016. He came out with his 3 strategic imperatives for the whole company that included top quartile financial performance, world-class innovation, and a commitment to corporate social responsibility. So with that being the top 3 for the whole company, it led us into the discovery of our purpose, which in 2017, which is for those who make the world. We're a company that makes a lot of products that help other people build, whether it be our tools or infrastructure or equipment. And then subsequently, the purpose led into our social responsibility strategy with 3 pillars of people for those, product who make, and planet the world. And since then, we've also joined 180 CEOs and businesses signing the Business Roundtable's new statement on the purpose of a corporation, which moves away from the shareholder primacy concept to considering all stakeholders. So that is sort of a journey of how those actions and engagement by leadership has helped transform our company. And for the second question, I think the first compelling reason is one of self-preservation for businesses, right? Business can't exist without the environment, period. So if you want the business to be around, we need to have the earth around. Second, it helps to make sure you're aligned to the true reason for business, which is to help people, right? Improve the societal needs, while also staying within planetary boundaries doing that. And then a little bit deeper into sort of more corporate metrics, right? In the short term, you can increase revenues and decrease costs through sustainability. And longer term, you've got brand reputation, employee retention, and risk mitigation. So those are all ways you could tie sustainability back to traditional business metrics.
Great. Thank you so much. Lisa.
Yeah, what Dan just said is very important. Getting your high-level engagement is really important. Sometimes that's harder to do, and sometimes it takes a bit of time or a change in a CEO. One thing that we've seen that's really helpful is for corporations or teams to do a materiality assessment. If you understand what your stakeholders feel is important to your company and about your company, it helps to engage that C-suite. You're now connecting your sustainability strategy, your projects that you want to do, with what's really important to the company stakeholders and to the company. And I also want to weigh in on what Dan said about sustainability. That sustainability isn't just about sustainability of people and planet outside of the company. It really is about sustainability of the company itself. And that should be number one. That's a really wonderful place to start.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's a really powerful insight that, linking it back to, what's really important to the stakeholders. Okay, so let's see. The second question that we have is, how do you use the LCA in the design process? And how do you identify your hotspots? I think this is getting a little bit more into how do we implement it?
Yeah, and lifecycle assessment is a really great tool for assessing sustainability. And while I think it is an awesome tool, I'll be the first to say it's not your only tool. So sometimes you're going to need to look at other tools as well. But LCA helps with the design process by helping you look at where in your product life cycle, where are those impacts occurring? What types of impacts are occurring? And where do you have leverage in them? So you're looking at what different parts of the life cycle have some impact. And then as you're doing your design, it helps you choose materials. Look at, oh, it's the mass of the product that's giving me the problem. So I can focus on reducing that. Or it's the transport, where again, if I reduce the mass or I change where my suppliers are, I can make big changes. LCA is a really great tool for helping not just reduce environmental impacts, but also reduce costs, because very often you're identifying areas of energy consumption, and energy costs money. So wherever you can do that, the better.
Yeah, great. All right, thank you. And Will, do you want to weigh in on this one as well?
Yeah, I think from a sort of more practical designer's viewpoint, it's when you can use this tool. And what we found recently is that the earlier you can use it in the design process, the more impact you can have. It's that classic, the earlier you make the design decisions, the less it costs to make a change, and the more opportunity for change and impact you have, which is really a bit of a change from how LCA has typically been used to sort of benchmark product performance once products are on the market. So this is something where we're really encouraging people to try and evaluate their early stage concepts or system design with an LCA. And you don't need to have a full detailed bill of materials or know every detail of the product to run it. It can be daunting when you open up some of the detailed LCA software and you see this whole swath of items you need to fill in. But there are ways you can make assumptions and simplifications to let you perform these LCAs on concepts. You can do that within some of the more complete tools, or you can use simplified tools that are out there that have more limited databases, are not as fully featured, but they give you a place to start and will let you make those early decisions and highlight what your big impact areas are, which for some people are surprising. Like gut feel isn't always, when you haven't got the experience in the area, you can't always make a gut decision on, oh, I know exactly what the impact's going to be. So yeah, it's something we're working on, and we want to develop easier to use LCA tools for designers, things that you can work with early in the design process when there's large amounts of uncertainty. And we're actually working with Earthship to hopefully develop something that is going to be easier to use. But right now, I'm using other tools and just making assumptions and trying things out. So early on, you might not be sure what material you're going to use, but you could run one with one material and then just copy that assessment and run it again with a different material and do a bit of a sensitivity analysis, see whether that matters or not, see whether that's an area you need to focus on going forward, or whether it's something you don't need to focus your efforts on, you can focus elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
Martine, if I could jump in, we had a question that somebody didn't know what LCA meant, and I apologize for that. LCA is Lifecycle Assessment, and it's when you look at the impacts of a product, the environmental impacts of a product from raw material extraction through to disposal. So you're looking at the inflows and outflows at each stage in the process, and really looking at resources coming out of the ground and emissions going into the air, water, and soil, and how those can affect ecosystems, how they affect human health, and how they may affect future generations.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that there are several different industry standard tools, and we're not going to cover all of that today. But in the ebook, we will reference those as well as these sort of more lightweight tools that Will's also referring to. I think it's important to know that there are some industry standard ways to do it, but that they may not be broadly applicable to everybody in every phase of the product development process. So depending on where you're starting with your product development, you might choose a different tool.
Yeah, and John Gupta said there are different impacts you can measure as well. So if you're most interested in CO2 equivalent emissions, then that's what you run your assessment with. But depending on your product, you might be more interested in water use or ecotoxicity, and that's where you'll either choose your impact assessment method or use a broader method that gives you results in a number of areas. And that, if you're early in your journey, can help you focus your efforts on the area with the biggest impact coming from your product or system.
Yeah, which we call hotspots. So I think these questions are actually sort of neatly reflecting the overall sustainable process that you might be using. So first, you want to get buy-in, you want to identify what's important to your stakeholders. Then you ideally run an LCA or even a lightweight LCA, a lifecycle assessment to identify some hotspots. And then next, I think the big question is, once you have these hotspots, once you know what might be most impactful for your product, how do you prioritize them? So let's start with Sharisa. Do you want to get started on this question, Sharisa?
Yeah, I think that what a couple of people have mentioned is, LCA is a really powerful tool, but it's also just one tool out there. And I think one of the important things to remember, it is just a snapshot in time, and it is just as good as the data that you put into it. I think one of the pieces when I've looked at prioritizing the LCA or some type of environmental impact assessment is making sure that you look at it with the lens of your company. So, specifically for product designers, you probably know what the product roadmap looks like. So that's a snapshot in time when you've conducted it. You know what the product might be changing from a material or even a manufacturing standpoint. And so making sure that you have considerations there in terms of how you're focusing on specific material applications. I think it's also important to engage with your procurement or supply chain team to understand how the allocation of business might be changing within your given business strategy. Because I think that, again, looking at the energy intensity or the manufacturing impact as that changes over time, I think, it takes a little bit of time to mobilize efforts. And so making sure that you're not just fixing the problem as it stands today, but looking forward. And I think that's one of the really important things that an LCA can show you is, as you see what it exists as today, it can inform how you're making decisions moving forward. So I would say the biggest thing is making sure that you're looking at it with the lens specific to your company and specific to your industry.
That's a great point. Lisa, do you have things you want to add about hotspot prioritization?
I guess the only thing I would add there is, look at where do you have leverage. If some of the hotspots are going to be totally out of your control, as Sharisa said, they may be not of interest to your company, but they may also be something you don't have control over. But it's sometimes something you think you don't have control over, you can influence. Procter & Gamble did a LCA of their laundry detergent, figured out that hot water and warm water were the biggest impacts for washing clothes and for their detergent cradle to grade. And so they put in this whole effort to reduce the temperature of their product. But it still required a lot of customer education, and still does today, to get people to actually lower the temperature of their washing machines. And so you look on every box of Tide, it really talks about wash in cold water. You're going to reduce your impact and reduce your costs. So it's a big education piece sometimes. But so don't just say that's totally out of my control, because sometimes you can influence those things.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight for any audience members who aren't familiar, lifecycle assessment is also a powerful tool because it has a pretty wide lens, and it also incorporates things like where the resources that you're using come from. So you can choose, minerals mined in different locations, and energy generated in different locations, and also things like transport, which I know is a question on everybody's mind. Am I going to have to air freight it around the world, and what will the impact of that be? So I think that's another really interesting thing about life cycle assessment tools. All right, well, we are going to keep talking a little bit about hotspots, because I think that's one of the most interesting things that we see here. So I'd love to go around and hear from all of the panelists. And can you summarize for us, in your careers, can you talk about one interesting or surprising hotspot that you've seen? So let's start with Daniel.
Thanks, Martine. I'm going to do two, but I swear I'll be quick because I think I just have two good ones. So,
no, we're doing great on time.
The first is more of a stakeholder hotspot. It doesn't come from the scientific LCA tools. And it's packaging. And we have a significant focus at our company on packaging, even though when you run it through the lifecycle assessment tool, it scores as pretty much insignificant, right? We're a durable goods company. our products last a long time, different than sort of the fast-moving consumer goods like Procter & Gamble and the things you use and go through a lot every day. So that even makes it less impactful. But, the customers interface with that they see it only for a little bit of time. They're responsible for its disposal or recycling or trying to understand that, or, depending on what the material is and what their local infrastructure is, right? So there's this very strong passion around packaging. And so I think that side of that materiality assessment that Lisa was mentioning is that those things have to come in, right? And, our CEO on company-wide town halls talks about how his family gets on him about making our packaging better, right? And saying, get on it, right? Because, people are complaining it's hard to get into the stuff at Christmas. So it's just one of those things, I think, that, it doesn't always have to show up at the top of the scientific to really make an impact, right, on your brand and your reputation. And then the second area that I found was interesting was a comparison between our professional grade tools, like, for example, DeWalt versus Black & Decker on the consumer side. And, for DeWalt tools, they're designed for people that they rely on that for their job, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And so I really figured that those tools would be very heavily energy use dominated. And it turns out at the end of the day, it's about 50-50 between material use and energy use. And then when you get to the consumer side, right, they use it way, way less. So pretty much energy is irrelevant on consumer tools. And it's all about the materials that go in. So, you can have, again, it's showing drill for professional, drill for consumer, widely different LCA profiles based on life use. So, thanks.
Yeah, that's so interesting. The number of hours used is just so vastly different that it really changes how your hotspots, what's the most important thing.
Right.
All right, great. Let's move over to Sharisa.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting pieces when I've done LCAs in the past, looking at different products, is looking at mass mobilized. I think, again, it's really the LCA is as good as the data that you put into it. And so if you're just putting in, this is how much materials in this product once it ships, it, misses a lot of that picture. And so I think when you're looking at the LCA, and depending on what program you're using, you kind of slice and dice and see, which materials are pretty impactful just, per their weight basis. And so when you start going back into your supply chain and hopefully this is part of the exercises that you're starting to learn more about your actual manufacturing process. I think one of the interesting things that I've seen is that a material that, gets a lot of headlines, but is, in a small amount in your product, it actually could have a much larger impact, when you're looking at the mass mobilized in terms of how much material is actually moved from the moment that, you're digging out of the ground to actually getting into your product. And so I think from that, in my past work, there's been a lot of projects that have birthed kind of, the material efficiency and the process efficiency of that. Whether you're talking about a magnet that you can change the kerf with by changing the cutting device so you're not losing as much in the cutting process, or looking at different manufacturing processes where it's more additive as opposed to, retractive manufacturing, I think is really interesting. So again, just making sure that even when you're inputting like, I have like 5 grams of aluminum in this shipped product, what does that actually mean when you're looking upstream?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. If you have to move, 5 tons of aluminum to use 5 grams, right, your impact can be widely different. Yeah. All right, great. Will?
Yeah, I think something that may not be a surprise to people who've done this a lot, but we were going through and doing some benchmarks of previous products and found that consumer electronics and wearables that we're expecting, it'll be the plastics or things that a lot of people have been publicly complaining about, plastics, batteries. When we actually ran the analysis, a lot of the time it was the integrated circuits. So the little MCUs, the little chips on the PCBs that are some of the lightest weight components of the whole system were actually contributing a significant portion of the overall impact and were the biggest contributor in a single component. Digging into this a bit more, it was all about the manufacturing techniques, about the high energy and the gases used in etching and very high global warming potential gases that are lost. So yeah, that was a surprise, and it's one of these challenging ones that it's difficult to make an immediate switch because they're so integral to the product. But it allows us to think about how we can have business model strategies or working with suppliers and vendors to say this is something we care about and influence their process to minimize the impact there.
Yeah, absolutely. And in our ebook, we'll talk a little bit more about some of those materials. I think some of the material impacts of integrated circuit boards are also really challenging. And so that's another area of focus that I think is surprising for a lot of people. There's a great LCA example of a coffee pot. And in the end, I think that integrated circuit board is actually more impactful than trying to integrate recycled plastic in the lid and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and you can get a lot of these publicly available LCA data from Apple and things like that, and you can see it reflected in all the data they're publishing as well. So once you start looking into it, it becomes common knowledge.
Yeah. All right, Lisa.
Yeah, I think I'll bring up another one that people I think don't think about very much. This was an LCA was over 10 years ago, but we were working with a company that was developing a bio-based rubber, in fact, and it was based on sugar, so sugarcane, and the sugarcane was coming out of Brazil, and the biggest hotspot we found was, in fact, a pesticide that has been banned in the U.S. since the 70s, still used in Brazil at the time for use in sugarcane in the plantations. And it was a big surprise to the client, in fact. But in a way, again, it offered an opportunity for them to make really significant change. That pesticide was not only causing ecological damage, but it was also being exposed, the farmers, the folks who were using it were also being exposed to it. And so it was a social impact. It was a way to engage their suppliers around the concepts of sustainability in a way, hey, you don't need this pesticide anymore. Here's a better option that they're using in the US. Use this one instead, and then you can stay in our supply chain. And now you've helped the health of the farmers and as well as your own supply chain, the environmental sustainability of your own supply chain. So it was a really interesting finding. And what was further interesting for the company was that was only the first of many times where they found that, surprising to them, the biggest impact, that biggest hotspot in their supply chain was almost always the agricultural products. And they did not expect that at all. You grow it, it must be good, right? Not necessarily true. We use a lot of resources and we do a lot of emissions when we grow crops. So it's not necessarily the no-brainer that we think it is.
That's so interesting. Yeah, thank you for that perspective, because I think that's certainly something that that I often trip up against is having that green means green fallacy. That actually might tie in nicely to our next question. We've had some questions from the audience during registration about bioplastics, and I think plastics in general. We had several questions, and plastics are getting sort of a bad reputation these days. So this question is, what could product designers do to improve their relationship and use of plastics? Let's start with Will, and we're also going to hear from Sharisa and anybody else who might want to chime in.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I want to jump in and say that plastics aren't always bad. In some cases, they are the right material to be using, but when you're making that material selection, you want to be making sure you're including your sustainability considerations along with your other material selection criteria, whether it's strength, stiffness, cosmetics. So it can still be the best material, and sometimes it will be the optimum material to use for the sustainability impact as well. Just that should be part of your consideration in your material selection that you're making. And some of the big things we've seen recently that getting a bad rap is what happens with the plastics at the end of life, like where they end up in the waste stream, or even worse, just in the rivers or oceans. And that's something that a lot of people will not take responsibility for as designers, but I think there are ways you can engage with the end of life of your products, whether it's actively trying to recapture them and take them back at the end, or making it easier for them to be disposed of or recycled in a responsible way. So that's something I think really user-centered design and taking into account the whole of the product lifecycle is really important. Think about end of life as well. Then, if you can reuse plastics, reuse components, or even just the whole product, then that's extending the life, reducing the impact, and what you want to sort of the first priority. And then, if you can't do that, recycling is another option. It shouldn't be the go-to, just we'll recycle at the end of life, but there are also ways as designers you can make that easier by using plastics that are easier to recycle, making it easy to separate them, or only using the same plastic throughout. So it's something that's easier to get into a high quality recycling stream. On the bioplastics, they are an option, but as Lisa said, like, there can be big impacts from them. You need to consider where the feedstock's coming from. Is it competing with food sources? Ideally, some plastics, we've spoken to suppliers, the feedstock is a waste product from the paper or the wood industry. So that is something that's much more positive. It's becoming more circular. You're taking a waste product from one industry and using it as a feedstock for the others. And we've seen bioplastics that can cover a lot of the material properties that you're looking for from some of the bulk plastics. PHA is a good example. You can customize the monomers there and design a polymer that can meet most of your requirements for consumer electronics, especially. There are challenges in processing. The thermal control needs to be a bit tighter, and there is definitely some specialist processing that's required there. But I think this is something that's going to become more common as we go forward, as we're looking to find more circular plastics, so ones that we can take from a feedstock and then use, and then at the end of life, recapture.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I love that as this industry is shifting and as these plastics are getting more common and more popular and as demand goes up, this plastics industry is really shifting very quickly. It seems like every month we get updated information about new options for the industry. So that's a really great point. Sharisa, other things?
Yeah, I would also echo that. I think plastic is actually a fantastic material when used appropriately. I think the bad rap that plastic is getting is kind of twofold. I think the first piece is that it's often used in single use case scenarios, which is not a scenario in which plastic should ever be used. Plastic is something that should endure. It's something that's designed to last a really long time. So I think that's one cultural separate piece that maybe is not as relevant to this discussion, but single use anything I think is a general consumption sustainability issue. But when we're talking about putting plastics within our products, I think kind of Will touched on this. I think the important piece is looking at durability. So the most important thing is that your product lasts as long as possible. So when you are looking for replacements for plastics, making sure that it can still meet the product requirements. So one of the things that we talked about at Nike a lot when we were looking at different materials for the sustainable product design team, it was low impact, high performance. So you don't want to take any hits in terms of taking any leeway and making sure that the materials, are not meeting your standards, because at the end of the day, you want your product to actually exist as that product for as long as possible. And then, I think, Will touched on this as well. When you're looking at bio-based products or bio-based plastics, it's both looking at the feedstock, but also looking at the end of life scenario. You're seeing a lot of bio-based plastics coming out that tout compostability or biodegradability, but you really need to look into what that end of life scenario looks like. I mean, I think when most people think compostability, you think you can toss it out in your garden and see it break down over a short period of time. And a lot of those plastics, PLA is a big one that's been making the news, and that's not really how the compostability requirements are met. So looking both upstream, so making sure that the feedstocks aren't incurring a huge environmental impact when it comes to fertilizer or pesticides, like Lisa said, or looking at end of life as well, and making sure that as you replace it, there actually is a way to dispose of it and you're not just adding to the problem.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, there have been a few questions in the Q&A about, or just clarifications on bio-based plastics, and saying that some people assume they're all compostable or they're all recyclable. And there's a huge variety, and you need to consider the specifics and design it for what particular use case you have. Like, choose it appropriately, and don't assume because it's bio-based it's necessarily better as well.
Yeah, and Sharisa was saying in the background on this panel that there's no commercial composting in Hawaii, for example. So even if you have one of those cups that says compostable, it's going to be disposed of in exactly the same way as a regular plastic cup would, which is a really important thing to consider. Daniel or Lisa, anything else to add on plastic?
Sure. I'll just add one thing that, the big thing, and this goes along with Sharice's suggestion that we don't use them for single use, is plastic that's in use is a good plastic. It's not until it's no longer in use that it becomes a problem. And then it is a problem. And they all are a problem. So keep it in use, and then we're good. I shouldn't say that, but that it's the best solution we have right now for many of the things that plastics are used for.
Yeah. Daniel, anything else?
Sure. I mean, this is probably echoing many points from all of them, but yeah, just, plastic is made of fossil fuels, and, they're good in a sense, but let's try to, keep what we have out of the ground going in a circle, right? Rather than continually digging up more of a scarce resource to make this great material.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So speaking of going in a circle, let's talk a little bit about end of life, because I know this is also a really big topic for our attendees. So the question here that we have is, how do you start thinking about end of life scenarios? I know a lot of people are kind of coming at this fresh. Sharisa, do you want to get us started here?
Yeah, I think end of life scenarios, whether you're talking about reuse, recycling, or circularity or something like that, I think the really important thing is doing the due diligence to make sure you fully understand the scenarios that your product will exist in once it reaches end of life. I think there, again, is that misnomer that, something, if there is a collection strategy around it, it can get to the right place, and that might not actually be what's happening, especially when you're looking at geographic differences. So, I recently was living in the Bay Area, and now I live in Hawaii, and the recycling strategies and the availability of technology is very different. And so I do think one of the first things that you should do is do a baseline study to understand where your product ends up and what's available to your customer base when that product reaches end of life. Because the technologies or any of the design decisions that you're making to make a product more compostable or recyclable or circular or whatever it is, it's only as useful as what's available. So you can make all the right design decisions, but then if it gets to end of life and your customer base does not have access to your design intent in terms of how something's disassembled or reused, it's kind of a lost cause. So just making sure you do that baseline in terms of, what your customers are seeing, whether that's a first tier customer or a second tier customer, if your product is having a second life with a different customer base. But I, on an upswing in terms of, something that I think a general rule of thumb is, I think Will touched on this a little bit, is, homogeneous materials are always easier to recycle. The more complex a material stack up is, the more difficult it is to recycle. The very basic way I used to explain this at Apple is recycling is very much like a matching game. So if aluminum ends up at a copper smelter, they're not going to select for it, and it's not going to be recycled. Same thing, if a magnet ends up at a ferrous smelter, it's also not going to be recycled. So as a general rule of thumb, like something very basic that you could do is making sure that the material stack ups that you're looking at are as simple as possible, or at least as easily disassembled as possible. But that's obviously with the caveat that the disassembly process or technology needs to exist at end of life. But I do think that looking at more homogeneous material stack ups is something pretty basic that generally would work.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And as we know, innovation can happen in disassembly strategies, as you well know, through the amazing Daisy and Liam robots. But it is can be a major effort. So that's a great point. Daniel, other thoughts on end of life scenarios?
Yeah, sure. To me, there's two broad strategies, and I'll just touch on the first, which I think anyone in the sustainability field sees as the holy grail. But it's not always possible for every product, is, turning the product into a service. Because if you as the company own the product for life, well, then now the responsibility of figuring out what to do with it when it's no longer functional, it falls on you because you've never relinquished ownership of the asset. And that works well for high capital goods and things. But when you start to get down to a drill bit, I don't think you're ever going to be renting a drill bit. So when you look at, a certain amount of our products are still going to be sold, I think, and probably can never, or at least it's going to be a long time before they can make some kind of service transition. So what do you do there? And that's sort of taking that linear process and making it circular, and the broad sort of things we put in place. One, this relates to what Teresa said about, don't put something out there where by your design, you're preventing it from being recycled, even if you don't even have a good system yet, right? Start to think about, because your product might last 5 to 10 years, and by the time it reaches end of life, there could be a system. So it makes sure we're not doing things that are going to prevent reuse later. And then the second is try to start procuring materials with, either higher recycled content or bio-based after you've done all the research about, where it comes from. But, relying on materials that aren't extracting from the earth, right? Because not only do you get a benefit from the LCA perspective, but you're also, making it circular. And when you drive that demand on your buy side, you're also hopefully developing a recycling system on the other side, which if you don't have one, that's good, right? Because they're seeing a signal you want this stuff. And then your material supplier might end up being a customer and a supplier, right? They might buy material you can collect, and then you rebuy it back, right? So, and then one final thing we're in, I just want to touch on, it's really interesting about end of life. We're part of the Global Battery Alliance in a World Economic Forum, and they're discussing this concept of a battery passport, which is essentially providing this instruction and intention information you were mentioning about, what cells are in here, how has it been used, right? And so that when you get a battery at end of life, you can sort of read its health and say, well, is this good for reuse in maybe a stationary storage application, or does this need to be recycled now? I mean, is there nothing left in these cells? So, I mean, that's early days. And I think even the scope is going to be on EVs and much bigger volume. But, we have a lot of business relying on batteries and cordless, right, and electrification. So, even if it's not directly impacting us, we feel it's important to be a part of that and try to ensure the sustainable supply of lithium-ion batteries or whatever the next future technology in high-power batteries is. So.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And, this panel is great because I feel like I just learned something new. And I hope that in 10 years, we'll all look back on this panel and say, oh, yeah, remember that day that we heard about the, battery passports for the first time. Because it's true, I think this field is developing so fast that, sometimes these things that seem outlandish from the get-go, from the initial things, turn out to be totally possible in the end. All right, so let's see. Okay, so we're just going to talk a little bit more about innovation, and then we're going to move to some of the questions from the audience. So, audience, please start thinking about, I can see 182 of you on there, so please start thinking about questions that you might ask and submit. Okay, so our final question is, how can thinking about sustainability help with innovation? And can you give some examples? So, Lisa, I think we'll start out with you. I'm sure you have a lot of great options to choose.
Yeah, I have some great ones. So I want to use HP. They let us talk about what we've done with them, and I think they've got a great strategy. So we did the LCA on their first 3D printer. And one of the things, the hotspots that we found was the energy consumption of the printer itself. And the designers were totally surprised. The design is based on an inkjet printer, and in the printing world, inkjets have the lowest energy consumption. So this was the last thing they were expecting. But they immediately went back and started working on energy efficiency in their printers. So this was a great piece to help them innovate for the next level. But what was really interesting, we kind of explored a lot of space when we did the life cycle assessment of the 3D printers, because we were going after this for the first time, where could there be benefits? And one of the things we did, we were looking at automotive parts. We looked at what if by 3D printing automotive parts, we could make the cars last longer? And what would be the benefits of that? And the benefits were far greater than the impact of making the parts in the first place. So because that car, keeping that car in service for another year longer is a big deal, even if it was 1 out of 2,000 cars. And what was really cool is that HP took that concept back and they said, wait a minute, what if we could make our products last longer? What if we can make our printers last longer, or our computers last longer, our laptops last longer? And so they've been exploring, just as Dan said, they've been exploring their products as a service. And this new business model innovation came out of an LCA, and it was all actually the result on a different product, if you will, than their own products that drove them this direction. Just changing your viewpoint, and designers know you're stuck. You can't design something. Go out and take a walk in nature, and all of a sudden you get a new perspective. LCA gives you that new perspective. A sustainability lens of any type gives you that new perspective to look at things in a new way. And I'll share this one thing with you, Daniel, that HP actually, part of their service model includes their cartridges. And one of the reasons that they include their cartridges is because they can't get enough recycled material to rebuild those cartridges. So by this way, they're getting that back. So maybe you can put your drill bits and your batteries on a service model,
Yeah.
at least for your corporate clients, your big clients, and get them back and take care of them. And thank you for the information about the battery recycling project. That's really fascinating. Something I learned too.
Yeah, that's a great point. Those business model shifts can be so impactful. And actually in our ebook, we'll talk a little bit about business model shifts as well. Daniel, do you have other points that you want to make about sustainability and innovation?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So within our company, the actual name of our product sustainability pillar is called Innovate with Purpose. And so I just think there's a lot of power in taking the folks that are so into the technical details of how to design, and just say, hey, read the Sustainable Development Goals. Look at what they're saying is needed in the world, or look at the Social Progress Index and see how countries are ranking for basic societal needs. And sort of our flagship Innovate with Purpose product comes in an unexpected Sustainable Development Goal of the water goals, right? Typically, we're known for building buildings and infrastructure and things, but a project team highlighted that things aren't as efficient as they could be in terms of watering farms in India, and due to electrical instability, farmers have been flooding their fields overnight just to make sure that they get some water for the crop, even though that's not the most sustainable way to be watering. So we came in and said, well, how do we solve this? We need to get them on a stable source, the sun, right, solar, where they can know that they'll be able to water, but also, find a way to do that, because that's not a ton of power. And so we married that with the brushless motors we've been using in our drills to drive extended runtime for construction users, right? We used the drill brushless motor to drive that pump so that the efficiency was there, and you could now pump water more sustainably during the day off the power of the sun. So you take them off either the grid or diesel. You give them reliable, comfort knowing that they're going to be able to water, right? You start protecting the basin and the bore wells and the levels in there as well. So essentially you look and you find a way to merge where the needs are with what you're good at, right? So we weren't good at solar panels. We procured that. We weren't good at the physical part of the pump, right? But we replaced the motor that we had to drive it, knowing that we're driving efficiency for cordless tools, right? So I just think that there's a lot we get into our day-to-day and we don't sort of step back and look at, all the opportunity there is out there, right? To brainstorm on new things that we could be doing.
Yeah, and it's also interesting how rarely we're correct when we guess where we're going to be surprised, right? So I guess the point behind being surprised. Okay, so let's move on to some questions from the audience. I'm looking down this list. So audience, if you have questions, please feel free. So it does seem like we have several questions going about LCA early in development. So how do we do LCA when we don't have all the details? We touched on this a little bit, but Will, do you want to maybe start that one? And Lisa, maybe you can chime in.
Yeah, so I think one way we've done it as well has been looking at your previous generation products or similar products that exist out there and using them as a benchmark. And then that at least gives you usually a way to focus in on the particular impact areas that are going to be important. I think as well, it's someone doing it early without, I think one of the specific questions says, without getting bogged down in specifics. I think that's where you have to just try and take that high-level view and make assumptions and note what those assumptions are, and you can come back to them later. And as you move through your design process that's going to be iterative, you're going to do LCAs, and you're going to improve on your LCA, and you're going to reduce the uncertainty levels there as well by narrowing down the numbers, like narrowing down how accurately you know the mass of a product and how you know it's manufactured. But early on, I think you can make assumptions. And actually, some of the LCA databases, they have standard averages, or so I've used. It has printed circuit board, assembly, surface mounted, and that's an average, and it says it might be from a laptop. And that can be close enough for doing early stage analysis. You just take that, and that's going to be estimate the mass of the area of your circuit board and use that. Later on, you're going to be wanting to look much more at the individual components you're using and looking into more detailed databases. But early on, you don't need to do that. You can use these simplified, higher-level product summaries to reduce the amount of work you need to do early on.
You could pull factors, right? I know recently we just did a quick and dirty exercise of switching from expanded polystyrene to cardboard in packaging, right? And so it increased the weight of the package by 4 pounds. And the question was, well, does the extra transport weight offset it, right? So we could quickly estimate, by ton kilometer, a sea shipment, a truck shipment, show that 4 pound differential was this much CO2 emission equivalent. And it was much less than, the total weight in kilograms we transitioned from styrofoam to corrugated cardboard. So, again, it's not complete at that point, but those rough factors, I think, are powerful, quick tools that you can just use and get a gut check of what you're doing right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, we haven't talked a lot about cost here, but often we actually see sometimes that cost reduction actually will follow some of these benefits. So if you are reducing the weight, then your shipping cost goes down, or if you're reducing the amount of material that you use to make a part, then you need less of it, and so you pay for less of it. So I think for anybody out there who thinks that integrating sustainability into their product is going to make it more expensive, the case is actually often that it can be the opposite when done well.
Yeah, and the scenario analysis, you can do tons of scenario analyses early in your product design cycle, and they're cheap, they're easy, they're quick. Just keep running them. Run the best case, run the worst case. If it doesn't make a difference, wow, you can use anything. So if you use the best plastic and the worst plastic, and you're going to use plastic, well, it doesn't matter what you use. Mm-hmm. If you're looking at best case, lightest weight is plastic, heaviest weight is metal. Let's look. But it does make a difference. Let's now I have some direction as to which product might be the better one. So it can be really, really helpful to help drive direction that early. There is a methodology that I'll throw out there called Anticipatory Lca. So for those of you who pay for LCA expertise, make sure that the folks you're working with understand anticipatory Lca, because that's what you want to use when you're early in the design cycle.
Great. So I just want to acknowledge we have 4 minutes left, and we probably won't make it to all of the questions here, but we will try to answer which ones we can when we send out the follow-up. So don't worry, folks, if we don't get to your question right now, we'll try and get to it in a little bit through the magic of email. So Will Harrison, you have one here that's flagged, and then it looks like there are also a few Apple-specific ones. Shrisa is not at liberty to speak directly to Apple details, but I think there are some really interesting questions here about disassembly and how we can get to see a good return on investment there. So maybe we'll do that one first, and then Will, we can get to the one that you've flagged there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think some questions that come through around, consumer electronics and disassembly and things around that. I think there are a couple pieces. One, we've talked a little bit about, the most important piece being designing a product to last as long as possible. So that's definitely something that I think Apple, and as I know, most companies are trying to design towards. You want a product to last in the field as long as possible as that product. The next piece of that is, being able to reuse components. And then the very last piece is being able to recycle for materials. And that's where a lot of this, designing for disassembly, or in Apple's case, what we really believed was we wanted to design the disassembly. And this is very specific to consumer electronics. I don't know if this would translate to other industries, but as we did our baseline study, as I mentioned before, seeing what's accessible to our customer base globally. I mean, it's high volume shredding, so you're tossing anything from a smartphone to a desktop computer inside a shredder. So at the end of the day, even if you are designing for disassembly, where someone can take their phone meticulously apart, that's not really accessible to most people. It's going to be tossed in a car shredder. And so that's where, a lot of this ideas of being able to design automated disassembly, where we're taking things apart, with the DZ system, for example, that can do 15 iPhone models in a single system. That's where we're seeing a lot of the leads. And then I know some people were asking questions touching on, return on investment. I will say that, Apple obviously exists in a very special place in terms of the amount of R&D that we can do, or they could do in the environmental space. And I think just recognizing that a lot of things are at the beginning of the technology curve. And I know a lot of small companies, you might not be able to do that, but I think it's important to recognize that you can spread your efforts across different things. So doing an LCA, looking at hotspots, finding the low-hanging fruit that you can work on specifically in your supply chain, looking at things that your suppliers, can enact in their own supply chains and in their own operations. And then, if you have the, capacity from a resource and a resource standpoint, being able to do some of these future thinking things. So I do think that, Liam and Daisy were exciting projects, and I recognize that they, are very specific to companies like Apple that have that ability. But I don't think it's insurmountable for other companies to look at, what does it mean to be at the beginning of a technology curve? What does it mean to think, differently than, you might have before, in terms of, I don't need to toss an iPhone in a shredder. That's where do we go from there?
Great. Thank you. All right, we have 1 minute left. Will, take it away on this, talking about the design brief. So the question is, designers and engineers execute to the design brief they are given. However, people ask designers to incorporate sustainable initiatives. When will sustainable initiatives become part of the design brief?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big things that we're pushing in our design processes, taking them into account early and identifying at a company level what your sustainability goals are and how they align with more global sustainability goals, making them accountable and measurable. And then for each product or system you're developing, identifying objectives for that product that relate to your sustainability goals and identifying specific requirements that relate to that. I think they've got it right. You need to incorporate sustainability into the design brief so that that is top of mind when the engineers are making design decisions. We even talked about at a system level, making sure that your product requirements can then be broken down into subsystem requirements. So if you're having different design teams doing different subsystems, you've given them a requirement, whether that's, here's the amount of CO2 emissions that can be associated with a subsystem, or here's what we want to look into in terms of disassembly or reuse at the end of life. So yeah, I think that's right. It does need to be incorporated into the design brief early on, and that's a real sort of waterfall effect of you start at the top, you see what the big areas are you want to focus, and make sure you break that down all the way down to the design brief you give to individual engineers.
Yeah, I know we're a little over time, but can I add real quick to that? Because I mean, that's exactly how it works in our company, right? We have a product manager or marketing manager that goes out to the customer and says, what's needed? What does the next generation drill need? And so ways we're trying to essentially, because engineers have some flexibility to deal with the design and can put their own touches in, but it would be a lot easier if the design brief said to do it, right? So, we point to, we don't sell direct, so we sell to a lot of retailers and customers, right? I point to their sustainability reports. And then also a lot of this data out there through sites like Sustainable Brands and such that show, for example, Unilever's sustainable portfolio grew, 69% greater than the rest of the company, right? So there's big stats that I try to bring in and relate to those folks so that they start to try to incorporate it in there. Because that again, yes, would open the floodgates, right, of progress. So.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Panelists, thank you so much for joining us. And attendees, thank you so much for joining us. Like I said, if we didn't get to your question, don't worry. We will submit these to the panelists and we'll send a follow-up email on Monday with some summaries and follow-ups on these questions, and also include a copy of our ebook about our sustainable development process, which talks a lot more about some of these topics as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.